everyone. I'd like to introduce Mr. Michael Matt of the Remnant Newspaper, and recently of, I think it's called the Remnant Underground is the news program that
Yeah.
they've been doing every week. He has been a speaker at a number of different rallies, Catholic events. He hosts the Catholic Identity Conference in Pittsburgh every year. Just an all-around amazing man. He has a history in Catholic journalism. Yeah, there's not much I could say about him that he couldn't say for himself. So with that, Mr. Michael Matt. So Mr. Matt, we were wondering if you could give us a little bit of a talk. We know you've been very involved in this traditionalist movement, and so were your ancestors. So can you give us a little bit of a talk on what was the situation like right after Vatican II? Obviously, we weren't alive. How did traditionalists manage to keep the Latin Mass alive? How did they manage to keep the traditional faith alive, and in time when everything seemed really bad and arguably even worse than it is today, even though we like to complain a lot? So I was wondering if you could just talk about that for maybe 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open up the floor to some Q&A to see if anyone in here has some questions about more specific topics. Does that sound good?
Sounds fair enough. Absolutely.
Excellent.
So thank you very much, guys. I don't know how many of you I'm talking to or where you all are. I guess you're around the country, different places, but wherever you are, thank you for having me to this event. I'm very honored to be with you guys. I'm always excited to talk to young people. One of the reasons for that is, like, if I say the name Michael Davies, do you guys remember that name? Do you recognize that name at all? Does that mean anything to you?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I bring it up only because it seems like yesterday, I'm your age, and Michael Davies is trying to mentor me and trying to get me into the fight. So I welcome opportunities to talk to people who you don't seem that much younger than I am, but of course, I know I seem a lot older than you, so I know how that works. But we really need to think about what the future is going to be, what we're going to do, how we're going to keep the faith. And I like to, whenever I talk about this topic, I like to, just bring it back a little bit to the obvious, and that is that if there were a way for, I would imagine most of you would agree with me on this, if we could dispense with the word traditional Catholic, that would be fantastic, because of course it's very redundant. You guys know this. Catholics are Catholics. The problem is we use traditional Catholic for expediency because Nancy Pelosi is a Catholic and Joe Biden is a Catholic. And of course we know that's not the case. So it's important for us to, as we engage in this battle, which is exactly what it is, it's a war, to remember that all we are is Catholics. We're not trying to do anything different. We don't consider ourselves holier than other people necessarily, or more intelligent or better. In fact, speaking for myself, I would argue just the opposite, that I stand on authority. I stand on the shoulders of the great traditional Catholics. And of course, as we all do as Catholics, we make reference back to Augustine and to Aquinas. And what we're trying to do is simply keep the faith that we were blessed by God to have handed down to us from our parents. So I think in any form of apologetics or discussion or talk like this, it is so important to remind people we're not reinventing the wheel. In fact, our comfort zone is with the assurances that we're doing nothing more than what we were called to do through our baptism and our confirmation. Just keep the faith. That's it. And that way, we can argue that we have a certain degree of infallibility in that our opinion means nothing. And that what we're trying to do is just reiterate the previous teachings of the church and to defend those teachings, and most importantly, to live as Catholics. So for example, in my case, my great-grandfather was a Catholic journalist in Germany, and he was a Lutheran. He converted to Catholicism after he had a commission from his editor. He was a writer. His editor commissioned him to convert a very famous Protestant fellow by the name of Johansen, who was writing books and making a lot of waves in Germany at the time. So my great-grandfather's job was to try to convince this man that he was wrong. And in the course of my great-grandfather applying his Protestant principles and ideas and theology to the argument, he began to be won over by this man, Johansen, and he eventually converted to the Catholic faith. So in a sense, I'm a convert too, from a family point of view. We converted to the Catholic faith. And it was about that time that the great Pope Leo XIII commissioned these Catholic journalists to be very concerned about the Enlightenment, the errors of the Enlightenment, the errors of German Freemasonry, which were having an impact, especially on the peasant and farming and immigrant community that was coming to the States. Long story short, my great-grandfather comes to the United States, And he starts this newspaper called Der Wanderer, which became The Wanderer, which is the oldest weekly newspaper in this country. And then throughout the years, my grandfather then starts The Wanderer in the 1930s. During the war years, I'm trying to set this up as quickly as I can. During World War II then, The Wanderer, my grandfather's newspaper, was condemned both in the pages of Pravda in the Soviet Union and in Hitler's in Nazi Germany. It had so many German readers that finally the Nazi Party banned The Wanderer from being mailed from the States into Germany because of the effort that was being made to uphold the Catholic faith and of course go against National Socialism and communism at the same time. My father's in World War II at this point. He comes out of World War II, kind of in that period, sort of a hero. He'd been over there doing the war thing, and now he was going to get into Catholic journalism as his father and grandfather and great-grandfather had done. Everything was great. And my father and grandfather had based their polemic, everything that they were doing at that time, journalistically or from the point of view of commentary and their writing, had to do with defending the church, exactly as Pope Leo XIII had commissioned Catholic lay journalists to do. So if any of you are thinking about journalism, don't let anybody tell you that lay Catholics have no right to say and talk about these things, that only priests and bishops are allowed to. Absolutely untrue. And if you look at the Pius XI, Pius XII, Leo XIII's talk, their position on Catholic action, on Catholic journalism, we can easily dispense with that. We have an obligation to fight as lay Catholics, just like the priests have an obligation to fight as priests. That's our vocation. And so that was what they were doing. They were trying to defend the church against the principles of the Enlightenment, of Protestantism, of modernism, of secularism, of all these things that were coming through. But they were very aware that around 1904, 5, 6, 7, there was a great pope named Pius X who was warning incessantly against modernism, against the errors of modernism and liberalism and the secularism that we see now in full tilt. So what happened then after Vatican II? There were concerns about Vatican II. My family was heavily entrenched now in Catholic journalism. The whole discussion about what was happening at Vatican II was dominating the headlines, that in Vietnam. And suddenly these Catholic journalists who had always defended the papacy, defended traditional Catholicism, defended the teachings and doctrines and the traditions of the church, suddenly they began to hear the things that they had been fighting against. If you want to imagine the wall behind me is the Vatican, and these Catholic journalists are defending the Vatican and defending the popes, defending the teachings of the church. And all of a sudden they began to hear these same errors that they've been fighting against coming from behind them, coming from the church herself, which obviously what meant that there was an infiltration. I want to be clear about that. These Catholic journalists were not surprised because they were students of the social and teachings of the churches, of the popes, the great social teaching popes, especially Pius X, who warned. What did he warn? He said the modernists, where were they? Were they on the outside of the church trying to get in, or were they, as Pius X said, at the heart and bosom of the church? And this was in 1907, 1904, when he's writing these encyclicals. So they knew the church had already been infiltrated. Pius X did a wonderful job trying to defend, trying to push it all underground, but it was still there. So my point is, then after the council, they began to see that some of these errors now were coming out. So one of the big things that people say against traditional Catholics, you believe everything was just fine before Vatican II. That's nonsense. It wasn't just fine before Vatican. And traditionalists are so myopic. They just want to go back to 50ism Catholicism. And of course, my own family history dispels that. It's absolute nonsense. They were at war from 1864 onward. There were huge problems in the Catholic Church that everybody was aware of. Pius X, again, way back, early part of 1900s, was fighting against modernism already. So what Vatican II was the coming out party of the modernism that everyone knew was there, who was paying attention. And so after the council, immediately when it became clear that an infiltration had happened, that they had risen to high levels in the church, then the war starts. And another interesting lesson, if you want to take something from my family's history, you had two brothers, my father and his uncle. They're both running the Wanderer newspaper in 1960, whatever, 66. My father was the editor. And as the council unfolded, so it became very clear that there was going to be a choice, and my family demonstrate what that choice became, and it wasn't a good choice. You had to choose either between what you knew to be true and traditional and inviolate, and you must accept, and something new that was coming out of the Vatican, a giornamento, a new spirit in the church. But my point is, my uncle was a good man. So my uncle was saying, I have to be obedient to what's happening in the Vatican. My father, who I think was a better student of the great encyclicals, said, no, we got to be careful. We were warned that this was going to happen. We can't just blindly obey what's happening in the Vatican right now. This is what Pius X was concerned about. This is what Pius XI was concerned about. And so that division in my own family, a family that had been in the Catholic press for 100 years at that point, Vatican II comes along and blows it wide apart, just like it divided the church to a large degree. And so my father started the Remnant in 1967, 2 years before the new Mass came out. So it wasn't just the liturgical question. But you can see through just that little experience with my own family that the council was very destructive. And I don't want to scandalize any of you. I don't know how many of you are traditionalists all the way through, or maybe you're new to tradition. We don't reject Vatican II. In fact, I would argue that I personally, the Remnant, my staff, our writers, we accept far more of Vatican II than your father Jimmy Martin's do. You see what I'm saying? Like anything that is infallible, anything that we must believe as Catholics, and that is reiterated in the 16 documents of Vatican II, on pain of mortal sin and apostasy, we must accept. So we don't reject everything in Vatican II. We reject the spirit of Vatican II. We reject the novelties of Vatican II, which countless churchmen since have argued you're perfectly free to debate those things. Those are not de fide. Those are not things you have to accept. They're novelties, things like dialogue and ecumenism and all this stuff. Those aren't doctrines of the faith. So that's primarily what we're talking about. So that's just like a brief whirlwind kind of part of the historical part up until that point in my own experience, my own family's experience. And then comes the new Mass, and then comes real revolution. Even at that point, there were many people who thought, well, this is going to be something good because the church is going to be great. But the problem with that is that even John the 23rd, when he called the Second Vatican Council, he doesn't talk about horrible problems in the church that had to be addressed. If you read his opening to the Second Vatican Council, he talks about those doom and gloomers, those people who are the naysayers, who are always saying bad things were happening in the church. And he says, we have no room for that. This is the great spirit of the time of awakening. So he's not addressing problems in the church. He's doing something else. We're not quite sure what he was doing. Apparently he heard something while he walked in the Vatican garden that said, convene this council. But my point is that the council had rather shaky beginnings, and it's confusing. There's good and there's bad. For example, you know as well as I do that the council never called for the eradication of the Latin or of the Gregorian chant. Matter of fact, it said Gregorian should be given pride and place. But all the spirit of Vatican II was something else. And immediately, right away, the pioneer traditionalists, they knew it was coming. They knew something had to happen. They couldn't go along with what was happening. And so I guess I would say, by way of encouraging you, because we've all had really bad news recently with respect to the traditional Latin Mass, it was much, much worse back then. For about, well, from 1969 until 2007, we believed that, we were told, they told us that the old Mass had been abrogated, that it was outlawed, that you had no right to it whatsoever. Benedict came along, thank God, and dispelled that, changed that forever. That can never be changed. So that's one of the good things that we now know. Thank God Pope Benedict made it clear the traditional Latin Mass not only had never been abrogated, but never could be. And yet still, I point you back to the early 1970s. I was just a little kid. But that was what we were being told. It could never come back. The priests had no right to say that Mass. It was forbidden. Many of them felt that they would go to hell if they continued to say the Mass of Padre Pio and the Mass of all the saints and popes back to Peter. So it was a very, very disturbing time. It was absolute revolution, and there were very few options. We have options right now. You have options. You all know good priests. We know bishops. We have Cardinal Burke, we have Bishop Schneider, we have Archbishop Vigano. All this infrastructure that's still in place was not in place at that point. And so for a time, Catholics had to go underground. If you wanted to keep the faith of your fathers at that point, and I'm not talking about Latin Novus Ordo Masses going on at the local church. This was revolution. So it's the goofy green banners all over the place. You got Peter, Paul, and Mary doing the Sanctus on guitars, only it's the Holy, Holy. Everything was completely insane. And people were very excited about this. So I'm one of 9 children. My father tried for a long time after we lost the Mass to try to find a place to go to Mass. He wasn't eager to go independent or find something. So we would go to these Novus Ordo Masses. They were particularly bad. Remember, this is even before John Paul, who did make some reforms of the liturgy that were welcome, considering what was happening in the 70s. We go into these churches. We were called Roman Catholics at that point, like roaming, drop the G, Roman Catholics, trying to find a place to go to Mass. And I'll remember going in there with my 8 siblings, and my father would get about halfway through the sermon, and he would say, very audibly, he would say, "This is heresy." And then he would get up and march out. And this would happen, all 9 kids would go tailing after dad out of the church. That's how bad it was. It was absolutely unacceptable liturgical revolution. So then for a time, we went into the Ukrainian St. John, the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. We did that Mass, that liturgy for a time, and they were wonderful and welcome. I still feel at home there. But if you're Latin Roman Rite like we were, that was not a solution that you wanted to stay with for a long time. So while we were trying to find some place to go, the traditionalist movement went underground. If you haven't studied the Vendée, the uprising in the Vendée, I would heartily encourage you to do so. I've gone there, I've taken pilgrimages there many times. So we've got a book that Michael Davies wrote called The Rising in the Vendée. That's the historical. There's where the traditional movement actually started. That's where the Enlightenment got really mean and started wiping out traditional Catholics in Western France for adhering to the teachings of the church, including, of course, the Mass. But in the story of the Vendée, you see where they had to do extraordinary things to survive. So they had their priests, the non-juring priests, the priests who would not swear allegiance to the revolution, literally lived in barns, lived in the woods. If you wanted to go to Mass at all, you had to do it under the cover of dark oftentimes. You had to do it in the woods, again, in barns, underground, hidden. So there's plenty of precedent for what the traditionalists did then, early traditionalists did in the 1970s. We literally went underground. So I learned how to serve the traditional Latin Mass as a little boy in my father's basement. I always tell the story about when my father and mother went and rescued a high altar, a small side altar, but it was high altar, from the local church and stuck it in the basement. And it was all great until I'm sitting around getting a little older now, and I have friends over to play pool, and there's this huge altar in our basement, and it always required some interesting explanation because they weren't necessarily traditional Catholics. But that's the way it was. And so we found ourselves, and to this day, I really loved the low Mass, because that's all I had as a child was the low Mass, because we didn't have choirs. So kneeling in the basement, there's a circuit of priests from all around the world. Some of them, didn't speak English too well. They had accents. They were wonderful, wonderful people, wonderful priests. They didn't have pensions. They had no security, nothing. They left everything and joined this sort of, makeshift circuit all around the world, especially in the States. And my father's house was on one of those, was one of those stops. That's where I learned to fall in love with the Mass. That's where I learned to serve the Mass. And that, combined with what happened a few years later in France, the Great Chartres Cathedral, is where I learned to own my traditional Catholicism, and where I became quite convinced I could and would and want to die for it. But it started in those little basement Masses when I was a kid. So I would really encourage you, don't let them get you down. Stay up, whatever's going to happen now with Traditionis Custodes, whatever's going to happen. Remember, it's been worse many, many times in the history of the church. Well, where did it start? It started in the catacombs. The church did. The first solid, faithful Catholics, what happened to them? They became lion food. They were in the Colosseum being martyred. That's how it started. What happens to Christ himself? I'm saying the obvious to you because just to make the larger point, Christ himself, the church, in essence, starts on a cross. He's crucified. He shows us what we can expect. But always from the cross comes Christendom, from the blood of the martyrs, from the sacrificed little children, Agnes and Tarcisius and Barbara. It must have seemed to their parents that it was all over. And yet from that sacrifice comes this most magnificent flowering of civilization that anyone has ever seen in the history of the world. This incredible church. And you know the story. Look at Chartres Cathedral. Look at Notre Dame de Chartres, Notre Dame de Paris. Look at these buildings, testaments, unsigned testaments of love of peasants, of small people, little in terms of they weren't famous or rich and have money, but they had love and they had faith. This church was powerful. It built those cathedrals. It sent those crusaders off to fight for Christ the King. That's what we're fighting for still. But on bookends so far of the whole magnificence of Christendom, you have suffering, you have deprivation, you have persecution. Why would it be any different for us? And not only is it not different for us, but I think God is giving us a little bit of a break. Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, who is a controversial figure. I was confirmed by Archbishop Lefebvre when I was 10 years old because my father wasn't sure that the validity of the sacrament of confirmation. When Archbishop Lefebvre came in 1976 to this country, do you know that there wasn't a single bishop in the country that would welcome him? So my father welcomed him. He was the only one that would do it. And they had confirmations for hundreds of little kids who were underground Catholics at that point. Do you know where the great Archbishop Lefebvre, do you know where he offered those sacraments of confirmation, where he gave us confirmation? In this crazy, not crazy, but this tiny little wooden frame church in a cornfield, largely forgotten. That's where that happened. So my point is, who would have ever thought? And Archbishop Lefebvre at that point was completely and absolutely alone. Never was he a renegade. Never did he want to break with the church. Pius XII loved him, called him one of the great theologians, great thinkers of the 20th century. He never envisioned that he was going to end up where he was. And yet that's the way it was. God took it down, allowed it to go, the persecution to go to the point where there was basically one bishop left who, whatever you think of the stand that he took in 1988, changed history. Now, I could say, well, we weren't Pius X, for back then. My father was just trying to survive. He was a journalist. He was doing great work. Michael Davies once said that if it weren't for my father, Walter Matt, there would be no traditional Catholic movement in this country. So I could brag and say, no, it was us. It was the lay people. We were fighting so hard. The reality is, guys, it has to be from the hierarchy. We are not a democracy. We can fight, and we are foot soldiers, and we are crusaders, and we're going to fight to the end, no doubt about it. But ultimately, the church is God's to save, not ours. And he's going to save it through the hierarchy, through the hierarchical channels of the church. And so I would say that now, again, look back to the early 70s, mid 70s, basically had one bishop. Now we have many bishops. We have an awakening going on. And that awakening is going to continue. And I would say, in closing, because I think I must be almost 30 minutes here, I would say we can thank God for what has happened, because Francis has confirmed what the traditional Catholic pioneers, what we were saying, what my father was saying for 50 years, that there is a revolution in the church, that there is a new mass and an old mass, and that they tried to crush the old mass. Francis has come along and said, the new religion, this is him now, I'm paraphrasing, but you can look this up. He basically says this in Traditionalism Custodes, there's no room for 1,969 years of liturgical tradition in this new church that we have, which is it's a great confirmation. He confirmed something else. He said, just as the Catholics of the Western Uprising in England said, just as the Vendéans said, just as the Cristeros said, Francis confirms, it's the Mass that matters, friends. And I'll leave you with that thought. It's the Mass that matters to such an extent. It was abrogated. It was outlawed. It was never supposed to be seen again when I was a boy. And it's back to such an international strength, spiritual powerhouse that the Pope himself has to come out and very much, in a very real sense, embarrass himself in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of all this apostasy and the abortion holocaust. The Pope himself, who is a globalist, has to come out and say, we need to stop that Mass. Because if that Mass is not stopped, it can undo this entire new project that they've got going. I think we need to take that much more to heart right now, be much more encouraged and be much more inspired by the job that lays out that's waiting for us to do right now. I've said this so many times, and I really will close on that. Don't think of it as a duty. It is a duty because we're confirmed Catholics, and we need to do what God expects of us as confirmed soldiers of Jesus Christ. But I would say, think of it as a duty, maybe second or third down the list. The number one thing, I hope everyone who's listening to us tonight can walk away, at least consider if you don't feel it already. And that is, This is the greatest honor of our lives. I'm in my 50s. Some of you look like you're probably in your 20s. I'm telling you, my mortality is more obvious now than it was when I was your age, obviously. And I still look back over Michael Davies and Archbishop Lefebvre and all those pioneers, all those great fighters for the faith. And it's been the greatest honor of my life to stand with them, to stand with the successors of the Vendéens, the successors of the Cristeros. And we're telling the stories of the Cristeros. We're telling the stories of the Vendéens. Why? And the Crusaders, because they are the ones who we're aspiring to be like. And if we can take this moment right now and say, we're going to make the best, this is going to make me a better person, a better soldier of Jesus Christ, a better Catholic. I'm going to fight so hard because somebody gave me this birthright to be a soldier for the old faith. Guess what? Guess what? When you're my age, when you're dead, when you're gone, they're going to be telling your story. They're going to be telling your story just like we're telling the story of the Vendée and the Cristeros. And then we will know that we are the good servant that we all, when we on our deathbeds, want to hear. Well done, good and faithful servant. You know, that's a life worth living. We all have to die, right? I'm going to be dead long sooner than you are. It's not so much living until I'm an old guy in a nursing home, filling my pants. Pardon me if there are any ladies on the list, but you know what I mean? Do I really want to do that? Or would I rather lay down my life at some point, not eagerly? I'm not saying I want to be a martyr, but leave myself open to the possibility that I'll stay and do my duty. And if it means a little curtailed life, a shorter life, I will have done my duty. And I look back with pride on that, and I will have no regrets. So I hope that, I know I threw a lot of stuff at you. I hope it on some level helps you to become fighters, and I'm sure you already are, but the fighters that we're all counting on you to be, to take this mantle and just keep right on going. And thanks very much for listening. It was fun.
Thank you so much. You're always so entertaining to listen to. No other, like, don't tell Taylor Marshall I said this, but no other speaker is more entertaining and like fun to listen to than you are. I get so much enjoyment from watching you every week. I will say that you overestimated your audience a little bit. We're actually a bunch of teenagers mostly. We have a few 20-year-olds, but large group of high schoolers. So
even better.
Better. Exactly.
Even better.
But with that, I'm going to open the floor for questions, and I wanted to start out by asking one of my own. We recently had on a priest named Father Charles Murr. I'm not sure if you've heard of him, but he played a large part in investigating Freemasonry in the Curia in the Paul VI years. So he knew every player going on. And he was the chaplain to a bishop named Cardinal Gagnon, who was a visitor to the SSPX at one point. Yep. Very, very faithful man. So my question is just, how much do you think we can reflect on you talk a lot about this whole Unite the Clans project. How much do you think we can count on bishops like Gagnon or in our day like Cordileone and Strickland to be part of this whole project? And how much do you think at a certain point we need to cut it off and say, listen, like at this point, it's just like I think you sometimes say like neocon or like this like fake sort of conservative Catholicism. Yeah. At what point should we trust bishops like that to be helpful in our cause? And at what point do we cut them off and say, okay, this is just like a straw too far down the line?
I think it's a good question. I think it's important for us to leave our options open. It almost never, I think it very rarely benefits us to just give up on somebody. And I would cite as an example, which I did at the Catholic Identity Conference, because it always struck me as funny. I had watched a presentation on wherever it was, on a video, I guess it was, of Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, when he was representative nuncio for Benedict XVI, giving a Christmas message to the United States from the Pope. And I had seen that in real time. And I always say to people, can you imagine in a million years ever thinking that this high-ranking churchman, who was no traditionalist at that point, would someday be our, leading us, our champion, writing for the remnant, and really, really doing powerful and important corrections of the hierarchy? You never would have imagined it. So what I always say is, you got to, obviously, and you know this, always allow for the grace of God. That's why we should always pray for these men, because you just never know. And now we're at a very interesting crossroads. I mean, I think all of us would prefer, for example, that Cardinal Burke had done more with the dubia, that he had maybe, demanded more of Francis. But then again, we keep praying for him, and we don't know what his concerns and considerations are. So it doesn't really do a lot to judge him harshly because he wants to be at the next conclave. He wants to see if he can do something at that level. And in the meantime, with the dubia that he raised, all of us got marching orders from the hierarchy to fight and to resist. So I would say the Coeur d'Leons, all of these bishops. Now, where does Strickland come from? Where did Bishop Schneider come from? What's happening? Why are they suddenly waking up as they are? So I think it's, on the one hand, it's depressing. On the one hand, it's encouraging. I think the worse the situation becomes in the church and in the state, the more Stricklands, Schneiders, Viganos, Burkes we're going to see. And some of them, I think, are going to realize that it's not just traditionalism as it was when I was a kid. Liturgical question. They're fighting over the mass. The bishops didn't want to go along with the traditionalists at all. Now, if you factor in Davos and the Great Reset and the churches were closed and all of these things, these bishops have seen a dark side that I think that most of them were in denial even existed 5 years ago. So in a way, COVID has been clarifying for a lot of these men. And I think they do see the very real possibility that it's not just liturgy. It's going to be the abortion thing is going to get worse. The persecution is going to get worse. And the question for us would be, is collegiality, the things that has bound them all together ever since the council, is that strong enough? Does that have enough rewards for them to close their eyes to the persecution that shut their own churches down just last year? So I think we do have an opportunity. I think we should reach out to priests. I think, like, even when you see the Fraternity of St. Peter, the way they reached out to a lot of these bishops, and after Traditionis Custodes came out, those bishops have so far been the slowest to implement any changes, because somebody went and knocked on their door and said, "Hi, I'm a priest, a traditional priest, and I got just one head and I want to talk," and normal people, in other words. I think, especially for you guys, don't ever underestimate the power of youth. I mean, that's true. That when you show an interest in the mass, when you show an interest in your faith, they will listen to you. And I think the bishops need encouragement more than they need condemnation. We all know the ones that are not worth our time at all because they're clearly apostates. But then there are other ones who are pro-life and they seem to have the faith still. I think we concentrate on them, pray for them, reach out to them whenever we can, and bring them all lovingly into the light a little bit, because they're diabolically disoriented. We always talk about this diabolical disorientation. Well, don't be surprised when you run into it, and try to do something about it when you can. Pray for them, bring them closer, and maybe we end up with a couple dozen Viganos before you're my age. You never know. It's going to happen. Let's remain confident that it will in our lifetime. That's how I see it. Almost never benefits to condemn everybody. See what you can find. See if you can work with somebody, bring them closer.
Excellent. Thank you so much. All right. Michael has a question. So Michael, you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
What is your opinion on the stance of SSPX, whether it is in communion with the Catholic Church or not? And then once you're done answering that question, I have another question on Pope Francis' modum proprio.
Yeah, SSPX has been, I guess the quick way of answering it would be, in the Code of Canon Law, the 83 Code of Canon Law, a provision is made for state of emergency. Now, if there never comes a time where something would happen in the church that would rise to the level of a state of emergency, then what is that provision doing in the Code of Canon Law? It's obviously there. So then the question becomes, when we have a crisis in the church like we have right now, or like we had back in the 70s and 80s, obviously, and Archbishop Lefebvre, who tried everything he possibly could and was stunned and shocked and surprised and horrified that it looked like he might actually really run into loggerheads with the Vatican. He tried, in other words, to stay not to have any irregular relationship with the Vatican. He finally concluded that we have a state of emergency, and in order to preserve tradition, preserve the faith, which is the first order of theology, to preserve the faith, that he had to do something extraordinary. And so he consecrated 4 men bishops. That has been debated ever since I was a very young man. I don't know when it's going to be solved, but I will tell you this. My father didn't go along with the 1988 consecrations, again, because he was trying to be faithful. He loved Archbishop Lefebvre. He had me confirmed by him. But when the consecrations of the bishops happened, my father couldn't go along with it and broke his heart. And they had a parting of the ways. And one of the big concerns my father had was that the Archbishop was going to set up what they call in French the petite église, the little church, with their own little pope, their own little bishops, their own little hierarchy. That was the concern at the time. And I can honestly say that ever since that time, the society has done just the opposite. They have not formed their own little church. They've stayed as close as they possibly can, to the point now where Francis is telling them that they can have legal confessions and all this sort of thing. And so in the course of my career, I've kind of thought someone else is going to have to finally solve that very difficult and controversial issue. Personally, I think Archbishop Lefebvre was a fighter. I think someday he's going to be a saint, but even a saint could have made that mistake in 88. I'm not saying he did. I'm saying it could have been a mistake. But then if you say, by their fruits, you should know them. I remember what it was like. We were going to masses, as I say, underground in Holiday Inns back in the early 70s. There was no society. There was no fraternity. There was nothing, So if you look at the fruits of what Lefebvre did, you guys, in a sense, if you're all going to the traditional Latin Mass or the fraternity, whatever, you would be the fruits of what happened. In other words, a lot of good has come from that. So my opinion is, I don't think we necessarily as lay people have to solve that, but I think we should always be obviously cognitive of the fact that that's a debate that has divided really, really good men and canon lawyers on both sides. It probably isn't going to be solved anytime soon. Maybe it will be. But in the meantime, we have the luxury as lay people of saying, I'm not going to condemn them. You know what? They're trying to save their souls. We're in the middle of a crisis. I might not go to that mass. I might go to the fraternity or the diocesan guy. But we have the power, I think, to sort of to put the fire out. Like just clawing at each other over that. That's something I'm really sick of. It was a lot worse back in the 80s. It's a lot better now. The society never started that little church. And they're even now, they're still in more or less in negotiations. To me, that's enough for me. They're showing an anti-schismatic spirit by always looking to the Vatican, having these discussions, looking to find if there's a way to fix this thing, praying for the Pope at every mass, praying for the bishop at every mass, local bishop. Schismatics don't do that. So call me a lazy theologian or whatever, not a theologian, but call me a lazy one anyway. And it's something I don't spend a lot of time on anymore. I think we all just got to do the best we can to serve God and find priests that can help us raise children in the old faith. And that's just kind of where I am. So I don't know if that's useful, but that's where I'm at on that question.
Okay, thank you. My next question would be, since Benedict said that the Latin Mass can be said by any priest, and Pope Francis just came out and said that they need the bishop's permission, what are your thoughts on this, and why is Pope Francis contradicting Pope Benedict?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, I think he's contradicting him because there's too much indication that this is no longer a movement. It never was a movement for old people that was going to die out pretty soon. This is taking the faith back. This is literally reclaiming Catholic territory. And Francis, I don't mean this at all as like a pejorative, nasty insult. It's simply a provable fact. Francis is a globalist. He's working on globalist projects right now. And there's no room for, the idea that there's no salvation outside of our church. That doctrine, that dogma is not something that will fit well in a new order or in a one world church. So I think that's why he did it. I think that as far as, abrogating it, Benedict told us the truth. Every priest has the right to say it. I believe every priest still does have the right to say it. And then I'll let you in on just a little secret. I talked to Bishop Schneider about this, and he told me that the legalism is becoming dangerous right now. Like the legalism, we must obey because the Pope has shut down the traditional Latin Mass. We got to be very careful of that, because that would be a victory for Satan, for the powers of hell, if all of our good priests decide they're going to shut down and not say the old Mass again. Francis is simply wrong on this. And of course, I would say that because Paul VI forbade it. Francis hasn't done that yet, but Paul VI did that, and back in 1969, and we all just kept right on going to it. And lots of priests lost their security and their pension to continue to say it. That's my experience. That's what I think God wants us all to do. And I also think there's going to be a lot of debate about that over the next few months if the bishops really try intently to enforce this. Now, remember, when Summorum Pontificum came along, half the bishops never paid any attention to it at all. So we're used to bishops ignoring motu proprios, right? So I'm kind of hoping that the good bishops will repay the favor now and just ignore this thing. And at least to some extent, that seems to be happening already.
Okay, so your opinion on this is that the priests can still say the Latin Mass no matter what their bishop says, correct?
I want one caveat, and then I'm going to tell you, yeah. But one caveat would be work with your bishop first. See what you can get done. It's much more constructive. But if I were a priest and I had a Cardinal Mahoney for my bishop, I think I would lay claim to this idea that this is a state of emergency, and I would continue to say the traditional Latin Mass. I don't think I could obey that. Now, maybe I'd be different. That would be different if I really were a priest, but that's how I see it. And I don't think that he has the right to shut it down. And I think at this point, it's a harsh word. Nobody wants to say disobey your bishop, because as I say, ultimately, the church is saved through the hierarchy. But in my heart of hearts, as a faithful Catholic all my life, I think it's time to disobey this sort of order. I think it's completely unjust. He has no right, Francis has no right to try to crush the Roman Rite. He just doesn't. And that was sort of the same argument that we always use, coming right out of Quo Primum and Pope Pius V now, 500 years ago. No pope can shut down the Latin Rite. The Roman Rite can't do it. So I think we still use that argument. And I do think there's a good chance that Francis has lost so much credibility that it might become a moot point. I think a lot of bishops are very concerned about what Francis is doing, so let's pray for that. But yeah, I think they should continue to say the traditional Mass, the priest should at this point.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the answers.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much, Mr. Matt. And I am also a huge fan. Will actually got me interested in, he told me about the Remnant Newspaper, and, for the past 2 years, I've been an avid reader, and, really
Great.
Enjoyed all your videos and all the articles. And so
Thanks very much for that. I really appreciate it. That's awesome.
Yeah. So we have a question in the chat from Emma. She asks, what are your thoughts on the Eucharistic document that got officially approved at the USCCB conference today? And how can we as lay people promote devotion to the Eucharist, even as our bishops are not willing to stand out, against the pro-abortion politicians?
I don't know why this comes to mind, but again, I think manifestations of faith, uncompromising faith in the Eucharist, would do a really great job right now. So I think young people, especially if you can get Eucharistic processions going with a good priest, not to protest, but to show where you stand. I don't think it's great to use the Eucharist as a vehicle of protest, but to simply do this, manifest what you believe. I'll give you a quick story. I don't know if it applies, but I'm gonna throw it out there anyway. There was a Cardinal Archbishop of Paris a few years ago named Cardinal Vantois. He was historically terrible. He was a modernist right straight through. And yet, the organization that does the Chartres pilgrimage, if any of you guys, we're going to try to get it up again next year or the year after. If you want to go on that pilgrimage, let me know. We'll try to get you to go. It's a really beautiful thing. But anyway, the organization is called Notre Dame de Chrétienté, and they didn't give up on the bishop, even a Vantois. They finally invited him to come out to the camp the first night after walking for 30 days, how long would it have been? 10, 15 hours that first day. They had Vantois come into the camp to do a little benediction and to meet the pilgrims as they came in. And I will never forget, as I approached and I see all of these young people kneeling and kissing his ring, and there's Cardinal Vantois, who I knew to be a rank modernist, visibly overcome by the manifestation of faith that he was seeing from all thousands of young people. I don't know if that helps, but I'll never forget what I saw there. And I know that had an impact on him. Will it take something like that with respect to the USCCB's latest? I don't know. I don't know who's even paying attention to them anymore. I'm not. I'm paid to, so I do a little bit, but they seem to be getting more irrelevant all the time. I almost wonder if we should find other ways of manifesting our absolute dedication to the Eucharist. And we can get behind some pretty powerful cardinals. Get behind Cardinal Burke. His statement recently on communion to Joe Biden types, so powerful. And that takes all the onus off you. If you're worried about being disrespectful or whatever, scandal, stand behind a guy like Cardinal Burke, who's just firing away on this issue. Same with Bishop Schneider, but Cardinal Burke in a way is even better because he's American and he's a cardinal and he's defending the Eucharist. So I think we look for ways of getting that message out, because simply I'm not sure what we can do at our level to change the USCCB's position on anything, other than pray, which is very important. Don't let me be dismissive about prayer, but I think it's going to be really tough. They're so compromised. That said, Archbishop Gomez has been saying some good things lately, so you just never know. I never saw it coming from Archbishop Gomez, but in Los Angeles, but he has been saying some things, and I think he's stronger on the Eucharistic question. It's just that he's facing a lot of opposition to refusing communion to the pro-abort politicians. He's facing a lot of opposition, including, God help us, from the Vatican. So it's a mess, friends. It really is. It's a mess right now. We just got to try to hang in there, keep ourselves focused on what we need to do. Don't get discouraged, and don't expect a lot of immediate change from the USCCB, especially this week. So I guess that's where I would leave that.
Awesome.
Excellent. Yeah. I am a good friend of my bishop's, and we had my bishop, and we had dinner together a little while ago, like a few weeks ago or so. And he told me that this isn't some public here, the Traditionalist, this is Diocese of Arlington. He told me if there wasn't a statement released in the document about pro-abortion politicians, he's going to make one for his own diocese and just do what he can. So
excellent. Yeah.
I hope that there are more out there like that. But Christopher is a question a little bit more on the secular side of things, and he's basically asking about discernment of when to speak up and correct he's in public school, to correct teachers when they're saying things that are like totally wrong, especially about like gay marriage and abortion. So he just wanted to know what advice you had on discerning when to speak up, or when at times is it unnecessary or like uncharitable to correct them like violently. So he just wanted a little bit of advice for how to deal with people who are like virulently anti-Catholic, particularly in public schools and other public institutions.
That's a great question, and I think it's really important for people to, before you even begin to engage or to try to answer that question for yourself, you have to evaluate yourself. And I really, really mean this is extremely important. If you're the type of person that you got all the heart in the world and the spirit is willing, but when you stand up to make that correction, you begin to shake and you begin to lose some of your ability to put your thoughts together. And before you know it, Mr. Pro-abort, anti-Catholic, anti-Christian jerk crushes you in front of the whole class. God will be pleased with your effort, but you've actually caused more damage, because then the other kids, the other students can see that you weren't able to hold up your argument. So I think it's really important. Don't let your heart lead you. Make sure that you can beat this, that you can answer this. If you're not sure and you feel conscience bound to say something, form it in questions. Ask probing questions that now make the teacher seem a little bit off if he can't answer your questions. I think it's more important to not put such an obligation on yourself. Like, I don't believe everybody is called to go knocking on doors and proselytize and try to evangelize. If you're terrible at that and you're not going to win, well, do something else. Just start a prayer brigade or something else that is more conducive with your personality. So don't put too much pressure on yourself to always stand up and start screaming. The other thing I think is so important to remember, that there is so little moral advice anymore throughout the whole world. This is one of the great tragedies of what's happened to our church. She is the moral authority of history, the moral authority of the whole world. She has silenced herself. So for the most part. So even if you run into somebody that's into, gay marriage, going to defend gay marriage, we got to remember everybody from the president of the United States, even to the Pope, to the rabbis, to the politicians, has gone silent and weak on all of that. And so then this guy kind of grew up, not having any direction. And all he sees is you who don't like, you don't like gay marriage. And he sees a hater. It's like, what's wrong with you? Why are you doing this to this poor guy? He wants to marry his friend, his boyfriend, whatever. So I think putting all that into, taking into account the historical, what's happening. And now remember, that guy, even if he's pro-gay marriage, you might be the only face of Christ he's going to see, maybe ever, but maybe in a long time. Make sure that face is looking at him with charity. If all you can do is lose your temper, and I lose my temper all the time, so I got to preach this to myself. If all you can do is lose your temper and fly off, well, you're going to drive him further away. So I think all those considerations, obviously you can't do that spur of the moment, but just as you evaluate yourself, what am I good at? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? Always make sure that if you're shouting at the guy, especially in a classroom setting, you're probably losing. And be aware of that. You're probably losing, and you're probably going to push them away further. So I think it's really important now to try, and it's really tough if you're in a public school right now. I feel for you. I know that's really difficult. You still are called. We are called to lovingly lead these poor lost sheep who spent their entire lives in darkness. whose mother and father probably divorced several times. They got nothing. They didn't have anything. We have to find a way to lovingly lead them into the light, and that's not always going to be easy. But we have to try, because we might be the only person they encounter that even wants to do that with them, for them. So I would say take the bitterness and the anger, as much as sometimes it's frustrating and you want to just punch them out, try to take that out. Try to take into consideration they never had a chance. And then maybe that helps with whatever the polemic is, to try to lead them to the truth.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great advice. And I know that, we kind of had that instinct just to attack when our own faith and values are being attacked, especially in schools. And so it can definitely be difficult at times, but yeah, that was great advice. And so appreciate that. We have another question from Patrick. So going back to the theme of Vatican II, you mentioned some names there. Michael Davies, I've listened to almost every single video of Michael Davies on YouTube. He was amazing. I love his books. He's great. And so, like, what resources do you have though for someone who is trying to learn more about the history of Vatican II, the development of the Novus Ordo, and the history, and the development of the traditional Latin Mass as well?
Well, it's funny you should ask, because I happen to have a newspaper, and the newspaper has a 55-year-old archive. So that actually would help. I'm not saying that's going to be a comprehensive course, but if you get the e-edition to our newspaper, you get to go back to 1967 and just read all about how it happened. And most of it is searchable. The old ones, the early papers, are a little bit hard to search, but there's a topical index, so you can search everything. And I think that's really important. Learn the stories of Michael Davies. There's a guy. There were different people in each country, very few. So in Scotland, you had a man named Hamish Fraser, who was a communist, and then he converted to Catholicism, and he started whipping up on communists and bad guys and modernists. His book, Fatal Star, is a story of his life, Fatal Star, which I think you can still get. He's an incredible fighter, and he's a defender of the social teaching of Christ and the great social teachings of the church. And then, like in France, you still have Action Famille et Scolaire, which is a French, and you speak French. They were one ground level traditionalists. You have the Remnant, you have Christian Order in England, and all of these newspapers are still going, or websites are still going. Of course, you have Catholic Family News, you've got Latin Mass Magazine as well. But some of those magazines will help, especially if they have archives, because it's more real time. And if you don't have time to read the big books, and of course the big books like Iota Unum, you definitely want to read Iota Unum. I think another newer, more recent book is the book on Vatican II by Roberto De Mattei, which is in English. I can't remember who the publisher is, but anyway, that's a very comprehensive a thing, and I would definitely recommend that. The Great Facade is another one. We published it, but I'm not plugging myself now, because now that's available from Angelica Press, I think it's called. Yeah, that's another one that's very, very easy to read, and goes back into this, really concentrating on this idea that what we're looking at here for the past 50 years in the Vatican is a facade. So you're not being disloyal, you're not being schismatic. They set this thing up, they called it Catholicism. They've never asked you or any of us to accept any of this crazy stuff that they're teaching as doctrine. So we're not denying anything. When Francis says you must do Vatican II, you say, or you lose your Latin Mass. What about Vatican II do you want us to accept? Well, tell us. What dogma of the church in Vatican II are we breaking? And he won't have an answer for that, because it's just a facade. It's the creation of the illusion that this is the church when we know it's not. So The Great Facade is a fantastic book, easy to read, 380 pages or something. And now, of course, you've got guys like Peter Kwasniewski, who's a good friend of mine. He's doing a lot of stuff at Crisis and at our website that I think is really, really building onto the sort of Michael Davies, Walter Matt, the Remnant, that whole thing. And that's another great sign for, despite the bad news with Traditional Custodes, there's so many great fighters now, and really, really talented guys. Kwasniewski is no slouch. I mean, he's an academic. He's a smart dude, and he's really taken on that militant sort of approach to use his academics and use his intellectualism in defense of the church, defense of the Mass especially, and the kingship of Christ. There's so many more resources now than there were. And that's another thing to kind of keep in mind. But I think if you want some specifics, contact our office. We'll give you a book list and put you in touch with how you can get the archive. and you can catch up pretty quick, on all of that. So that's what I would recommend.
Awesome. Yeah, I've enjoyed the archives a lot.
Have you?
So yeah, I got my subscription a few years back, and so I've been reading all of those, and it's been amazing. So appreciate
That's
that.
great. Yeah, good.
Awesome. Well, I think that is an excellent note to end on. I don't see any more questions from people in the chat. So, Mr. Matt, could you close us in prayer, please?
Absolutely. Let's say Our Father, Hail Mary, and glory be, that for the intention that all of us, a little bit older, a little bit younger, understand the privilege and the role and the crusade that we have to engage in, and that we try to unite the clans, which is something that we can do right now. We're not uniting big organizations. We're uniting us, you and me. That's what that means. The foot soldiers, the guys on the field, can stay together, not fight each other, fight the real enemy, and leave the stuff that we disagree with, leave that a little aside. Concentrate on those who hate Christ and hate everything that we believe. Let's just pray for that intention, that we can always be cognizant of that. Even if you disagree with me at some point, you're going to be, yeah, but we're all trying to fight the same thing together, and we're not going to attack. And I think that would be a great thing to come out of this meeting. So in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Ghost, amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
Amen. Long live Christ the King, guys. It was a pleasure to be with you tonight.
Thank you so much, Mr. Matt.
Yeah,
Thank you.
appreciate it a
All right.
lot.
All right. Very good. See you next time.